This lecture, or this study, is looking at the life and teachings of Jesus as an historian might. What I mean by that is, what do we know outside of the New Testament about Jesus? And New Testament scholars typically separate this into kind of two different categories. There's the earthly Jesus, and then there is the theological Jesus, is how they put it. And I'll explain more about that later. But what this study is about is the earthly Jesus. What is it that we know about the earthly Jesus? And the answer to that is, surprisingly, not a whole lot. I mean, we have a lot about his teachings, but just about who he was as a person, we don't know a whole lot about. If you look up here on the screen, the picture there, that is the earliest picture drawing that we have of Jesus. And notice, I guess, what do you notice about him right off the bat? That's what I noticed about him when I first saw this picture. I know it's kind of fuzzy, but can you? There's no beard. You notice how Jesus is always depicted with a beard and long hair. Notice he has short black hair and no beard. I just kind of find that interesting that he looks very, very different.
Well, we don't know what he looks
exactly.
like. Other than how the Germanic painters painted him.
Exactly, and they painted him, with blue eyes, with blue eyes and brown hair.
Yes, or blonde hair.
Exactly, and you're making my point, which is we know nothing about how he looked. There was no, a physical description of Jesus or anything like that. Yes, sir.
One of my most interesting textbooks from theology school.
Yeah.
Was one that had the mini Jesuses.
Yeah.
And it had pictures, paintings of Jesus with all kinds of skin tone, all kinds of hair.
I'm going to show that picture.
Oh, good.
It's at the end of it's at the end of this lecture. I'm going to actually show that very picture. So thanks for bringing that up.
That was an interesting professor. He was fun.
So one of the things about the theological Jesus and the earthly Jesus too, is that earthly Jesus obviously is emphasizing his humanity. What was he like as a person? Whereas a theological Jesus is asking more the question of, who is Jesus from a theological perspective? And these two ideas have been in a great deal of tension with one another, for the past 2,000 years. And it's interesting how sometimes the pendulum swings back and forth on this element. So that today we tend to be very comfortable with Jesus being God, all right? And we're really, really comfortable with that. Believe it or not, in the early part of what we call the Jesus movement, that was the part of Jesus that made them most uncomfortable. And the reason for that is, you may recall last week we ended with the two big ideas that all the various Jewish political parties agreed to. They argued about everything, but the two big ideas that they agreed to were, one, this idea of eschatological hope. In other words, that somehow God's going to deliver Israel one way or another, and provide a way out of their troubles, and typically that included this notion of a Messiah coming to rescue them. But then also the second one, as you may recall, was monotheism. This belief in only one God. Okay, now if you put your thinking caps on, you can kind of figure out how, if you say that Jesus is God, that kind of gets you into trouble with monotheism, because are you saying then that there is a God the Father and a God the Son? On paper, that makes it sound like you're talking about two gods. And then when you add God the Spirit in all of this, now we're talking about three gods. So does that mean that Christians believe in three gods?
No.
Well, that's a hard sell. Okay? That's a hard sell. Now, when we get to the doctrine of the Trinity, we'll talk about this. But the reality is, the word Trinity is nowhere in the New Testament. It's nowhere in the New Testament. The doctrine of the Trinity doesn't come about for centuries later. And we're going to fight a lot about all of this. And where the conflict resides is, how do you reconcile the belief that Jesus is God with the belief that there is only one God? And that's a tough question. That's a very tough question. But what evolves out of this is going to be the doctrine of the Trinity that we hold to today. But what we need to realize is that while the New Testament was being written, they hadn't figured that out yet. And so there's a lot of theology that it's being presented here that will ultimately be used to undergird the doctrine of the Trinity. But at the very beginning, it's tough. So getting back to what I was talking about, so we're very comfortable today with the idea of Jesus being God, but they were very uncomfortable with that in the first century. What we are very uncomfortable with, though, I would say, in our day and age, is this notion that Jesus was also human. And both of these ideas were very, very important, even as the doctrine of the Trinity was being worked out, to try to protect both ideas about Jesus. He is God and he is human. The problem, just to kind of give you a quick illustration that this brings about, though, is that if God is infinite and humanity is finite, how can you have both in the same being? As one early church father put it, it's like a drop of honey, being the humanity, in an ocean of his deity. What would happen to that drop of honey in an ocean? It would disappear, which is actually what he was arguing for. Back when I was in seminary, Martin Scorsese directed a movie called The Last Temptation of Christ. Do you all remember that movie?
I never saw it,
You
but
never
I
saw
remember it.
It created a furor. A bunch of Christians got very, very upset about it because Scorsese in the movie imagined that while Jesus was on the cross, what would his last temptation have been? And he imagined that it would be Jesus wondering what his life could have been like had he not had to die for humanity. In other words, if he could have just been a normal man, falling in love, having a wife and a family, and just living a normal life. So he imagined this very human temptation that Jesus might have had on the cross of just being normal. And so that's what the whole movie was about, was just Jesus sort of imagining this as a last temptation. Now, at the end of the movie, he decides, no, I'm going to go through this and I'm going to, sacrifice myself for humanity and, obey God.
Considering his conception, he could never have been a normal human.
Well, that's a whole other story. That's a whole other thing.
I'm sorry.
No. What we can't get away from, Margie, though, is that he was human, though. He got his humanity from Mary, did he not?
Well,
so
yes.
he's fully human. He is fully human. He is fully a man, just like I'm a man, John's a man, Jim's a man. He was fully a man. And as a man, he had all the temptations that men have. Right? That was the point of the movie. And that's actually very good theology. But Christians had a cow about this because they just could not imagine Jesus doing this. But the reality is Jesus was human. He woke up grumpy sometimes. He had body odor, all right? He went to the bathroom. I mean, just like this is true for all of humanity, it was true for Jesus as well. But it's really hard for us in our modern era to get our heads wrapped around that. So anyway, that's the challenge that we have with earthly Jesus and theological Jesus.
Can I throw something in here?
Yeah.
If I'm not getting too far ahead.
Okay.
We as an entity, as a being,
Right.
are a duality. We have our soul, our spirit, which comes from God.
Mm-hmm.
And then we have this chemistry, physical body
Mm-hmm.
that God has made for us that we live in
Mm-hmm.
for a finite period of time.
Right.
That to me ties our humanity, or Christ's humanity particularly,
Mm-hmm.
to God, because God's spirit, which God is spirit,
Mm-hmm. Or his image and likeness resides in us, which is how Genesis puts it.
and
Yeah.
it also resides in Jesus
Mm-hmm.
as the divinity, but he's also got this physical chemistry, the biology, and this is from my concept as a
Yeah.
biology teacher. But because we're a duality ourselves, to me it's easy to conceive of Jesus with his duality for that short period of time
Mm-hmm.
that he was both human and divine.
Yeah. Yeah. Good point. So this then leads us to asking the question, what can we know about the human Jesus? You know, when he walked the earth, what can we know about him? And there are certain sources that we can turn to. The biggest corpus, or the biggest body of information that we have, were oral traditions. So we can see how this would naturally come about. You've got a bunch of followers of Jesus, and they have stories to tell about him. Oh, remember when Jesus did this? Remember when Jesus did that? Remember Jesus' parable of the blah, 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 all right? And so as the followers of Jesus were walking around with him, they remembered stuff. And then after Jesus died, they told and they retold and they retold these stories. Some of the disciples very well might have actually written down notes from Jesus' teachings. And had some kind of a written record of the teachings of Jesus. We don't know. We don't have any, obviously, copies of that. But I think it's not unreasonable for us to imagine that even though this stuff was kind of expensive, paper or papyrus and stuff was expensive, it's not. I think it's out of the realm of possibility that people wrote these things down. But the main corpus of this is just going to be these stories that people told. And eventually these stories will get written down in the form of our Gospels, but that's going to be much, much later. So the New Testament that we have is obviously something that that tells the story of Jesus. The vast majority of the New Testament comes from these oral traditions that were passed down to the gospel writers. But here's the thing that we have to remember about the Gospels. The earliest gospel was the Gospel of Mark. It was written in the early 70s. Jesus passed away somewhere around 30 AD. So 40 years later was when the first gospel was written. Can you remember what happened 40 years ago today?
About 4 years ago.
It depends on what you're asking.
Well, all I'm saying is it's a lot of time, and obviously these stories are going to morph over the decades, which is why you find different variations of them in the Gospels. But when the New Testament writers sat down to write the stories, we have to realize that they had these sources in front of them that they were drawing from as they were writing the Gospels down. They weren't making it up in their brains, all right? They, just like you all did back when you wrote research papers, you had a bunch of books and magazine articles and all kinds of stuff in front of you. So we have to imagine these gospel writers had something very, very similar to that as they wrote down the New Testament. Now, as a historian, though, historians look at the New Testament and they say, well, but these were insiders writing their own history. can we completely trust them? From a secular historian perspective, the answer to that question is we have to at least be critical of these stories because they were insiders telling the story, and obviously each of these insiders had an agenda, okay? And then we have to recognize what those agendas were. And when we get into the Gospels, we'll talk about that a little bit. So this brings about this notion of canon versus non-canon. Right? What I mean by that is this. There was a lot of stuff written by Jesus in the first couple of centuries. Not all of it makes it into our New Testament. Okay? There were other stuff, or there are other sources, I should say, that were written in the first and second century about Jesus that are still available for us to look at today, but are considered non-canonical. In other words, the early church fathers and mothers felt like that they either, for one reason or another, did not carry the same kind of weight and authority as the texts that we have in our New Testament. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
All right.
Yeah.
So there were a lot of things written. Yes, sir.
The one thing that comes up is the Q document, supposedly, which
Right.
was a predecessor and that Mark used as his resource.
Correct. Now,
Okay.
we don't. Okay.
We don't
so
have that
I was.
document.
I was trying. Yeah. So Q actually comes from the German quell, which means source. All right. So it's just the term that New Testament scholars use to basically describe the oral traditions that existed back then. It wasn't an actual document. It's just so Q and oral traditions are actually the exact same thing. But you're right, Jim, that from an academic standpoint, they call the oral traditions Q. And there are different versions of Q.
I'm sure.
And were they written down or were they always oral? That's kind of a big debate. We don't know the answer to that question. I tend to think that at least some of it got written down, which is what Matthew, Mark, and Luke are going to wind up using. Okay, so the canon that we have comprises of the letters of Paul, the letters from other New Testament character writers like 1st and 2nd Peter, James, Jude, those kind of books. Letter to the Hebrews, which is anonymous. But then we also have the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. One thing about the Gospels, they are all anonymous. We have no idea who wrote the Gospels. Now, there are traditions that get associated with the Gospels. So there's a tradition that Luke wrote the Gospel of Luke, that John wrote the Gospel of John, but we really don't know who wrote them, because nowhere in the text itself does the author identify himself. Now, New Testament scholars will refer to these texts as John and Mark and Luke, so that it just makes it easier to refer to it that way. But we really don't know who wrote these texts. Now, it's pretty clear that some of these traditions are probably not right. For example, Matthew's Gospel. If Matthew, one of the 12, actually wrote the Gospel of Matthew, don't you think there'd be at least a few stories in it where the author says, you know, Jesus and I were hanging out at Starbucks, and this is what he told me? In other words, you would think there would be some first-person stories from Matthew saying, you know,
Oh, there isn't.
There are no
John,
first-
There's no.
there are no first-person stories.
No, there isn't.
So that has led a lot of New Testament scholars to really doubt that Matthew wrote the Gospel of Matthew, is because
And
I mean,
John
if,
probably didn't write John.
well, yes and no. That's actually a complicated one, because it's very clear that John was the last gospel written. It's a very late document, and the consensus is that John was written by committee. In other words, there was actually this school called the Johannine School of men who were directly connected to the Apostle John, who wrote or collected what becomes known as the Gospel of John.
Okay.
Now, that said, there very likely is material in the Gospel of John that goes back to the Apostle John. So, of all the Gospels, even though it was the last Gospel written, there could very well be some of the earliest material in the Gospel of John out of all the Gospels, because it stands to reason that this Johannine school would have at least had some oral traditions that went right back to the Apostle John.
Wow.
Yeah. But it gets revised over and over and over again, and we have a last edition that winds up being what we call the Gospel of John. And so that's how we think John's Gospel came about.
It's like the School of Da Vinci, where Leonardo painted 4 lines that we know are his, but the students
Yes.
painted the rest of the painting.
Exactly.
But because he was there,
Yeah.
it gets attributed to him.
Fantastic. That's a great illustration for how it came about, or at least how the Gospel of John came about. So very good, very good.
Well, and one thing I think of there that ties John to John, or he continually says, the disciple that Jesus loved.
Yeah, the beloved disciple. Yeah,
Yeah.
he refers to himself as the beloved, but we don't know who that is.
Yeah,
Yeah,
agreed.
yeah, we don't know who that is. The assumption is that it was John, the Apostle John, and I think that's I think that there are elements in John that certainly trace back to him. There is an interesting theory that it was Lazarus who is the beloved disciple of the Gospel of John. Now, I don't think it's true, but it has some compelling arguments attached to it that the beloved disciple is actually Lazarus. All right, now we also have some non-canonical writings that are helpful, and we believe to be accurate to some degree, but they don't make it into the New Testament. For example, there's a first century document called First Clement. Clement was a bishop of Rome who wrote this particular letter while he was in Rome. Now, it didn't make it into the New Testament, but it's a really good historical document that gives us some insights into this, to this time period. There's the Acts of the Apostles that doesn't make it into the New Testament. There's something called the Didache, or the Teachings of the 12, which was probably a Christianity 101 text. In other words, if you were interested in joining a congregation, they would use the Didache to teach you basic theology that was around in the first century. Really helpful document, and one that I would encourage you all. You can find it online, and it's not very long, and it's a really important document. Doesn't make it in the New Testament, but very insightful in helping us to understand the era of the New Testament.
Didache?
It's called Didache. It's also entitled The Teachings of the 12. It's another title for it.
Now I got homework.
All right. Now we also have some extra biblical sources. What we mean by that is, so historians separate things into primary sources and secondary sources. All right. So primary sources are letters or a census, tax documents, contracts, anything like that was actually written during the era that you're studying. That's called primary source. Secondary sources use that material to come up with a narrative, come up with a story. There's a very famous book entitled Antiquities of the Jews, written by a Jewish author named Josephus. Josephus was a historian, right? So Josephus is going to take a lot of primary source material and create a history of the Jews that he calls the Antiquities of the Jews. Believe it or not, there is a chapter in the Antiquities of the Jews that talks about the followers of Christ. Okay? It's not very long, it's very, very short, doesn't really give us a whole lot of material, but it's evidence that there really was a historical Jesus, that he really did have a following, and that he was crucified, because those are all three things that Josephus mentions in his Antiquities of the Jews. So those are extra biblical sources that we have that give us some insights into this time period as well. All right. Now, earthly Jesus, what do we know about this guy? Well, he was born in the sticks, right? Nazareth was in the small town out in the middle of nowhere, and so here we do know from several of these sources that this is where Jesus was born and raised, right? We know very little about his early life, right? What do you know about his early life? What are some things that we just from the material that we have? What are some things that we know?
Just from the Bible, that when he was 12 years old.
There's that. Do we know anything that happened before that, though? He was born to Mary.
And Joseph.
What was Joseph's trade?
Carpenter.
Carpenter. All right. Does that mean that Jesus was a carpenter?
We don't know.
We don't know. Probably, but it's not a guarantee, is it? All right, because not all sons followed the trade of their fathers. All right, but there's this tradition that he was a carpenter. But
Back in the day, yeah.
but there's no evidence that Jesus ever picked up a piece of wood and sawed it in two. All right, or nailed it. All right, so we really don't know. But we do know that his father was a carpenter. All right, and that he grew up in Nazareth. Other than that, Jim mentioned at 12 years old, he went to Jerusalem,
Yeah.
and there's that story of him teaching the scribes and the Pharisees and Sadducees, or not the Sadducees, but the scribes and the Pharisees there, and that he got into trouble with Mary and Joseph because he didn't follow the clan as they left Jerusalem. There's that brief story. Other than that, silence. We know nothing about his boyhood. Other than that, we know nothing about his teenage years. He just pops up somewhere around the age 30 and engages into a public ministry, right? Yeah.
One thing that's runs around in my head is one at 12 years old.
Right.
Mary is the one that chastises him.
Yes, yes.
And then at the wedding at Cana,
Mm-hmm.
who chastised him? Mary said, "You're needed. You go and do this."
Do what I say.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm your mother, basically. Do what I say.
Yeah, exactly. And so I kind of think those are two things we know about him, is that probably his mother was more dominant.
Yeah.
And because Joseph disappears.
Right. Joseph, outside of the birth narratives, you're right. Joseph disappears. We know nothing about what happens to Joseph. It seems, because in the Gospel of Mark, Mary and Jesus' brothers show up in Mark's Gospel to try to take Jesus home because they think he's crazy. And so it's interesting that Joseph's not with them in that. So it appears that by then Joseph has died or something, which was not unusual. Men died very early, obviously, back then.
Supposedly he was quite a bit older than Mary.
Could have been too. There is one theory that Mary was a second wife. Catholics have that theory because of what they believe to be the perpetual virginity of Mary, which means that she had no other children, that she remained a virgin all of her life. There's no historical evidence for that whatsoever, however. And so that is one theory that some Catholics proffered in order to maintain the perpetual virginity of Mary. Protestants aren't as keen on keeping that particular doctrine. And
so his brothers are really half-brothers or step-brothers.
There is that, yes.
If she remained a virgin, then...
Catholics will maintain that that they are from another marriage that Joseph had.
Yes.
Protestants aren't too keen on that. They say it's possible that Joseph and Mary had other children after Jesus was born, and they're okay with that. The term, however, could be a very broad term to refer to Jesus' cousins. So that is actually a possible way of of translating the text, though most texts translate it as the brothers of Jesus, arriving. James was a brother of Jesus, who becomes the first, what you might call head elder of the Jerusalem church. And it was very clear that he was a brother of Jesus. So, anyway, we know that he was an itinerant preacher, right? That he walked around teaching, gathered a following. Some believed that he was the Messiah, though we need to understand that Jesus is not the only guy who was believed to be the Messiah. There were many, many guys in the first century and even the second century who purported to be the Messiah. And Jesus was certainly not the most popular of them. I would say the most popular Jew who purported to be the Messiah was a guy by the name of Simon Bar Kokhba. We talked about him last week, who was the leader of what's called the Second Jewish Rebellion in the second century. He had a huge following, much bigger following than Jesus. But yeah, so there were others purporting to be a Messiah. He's not the only one. Obviously, Jesus is Jewish, right? And we need to also understand that Jesus' ministry while he walked the earth was only to the Jews. Okay? It's not until Paul comes around that we have any kind of a push to try to expand the movement toward the Gentiles. But Jesus' movement was only to the Jews. He never walked outside of what we would call Palestine, that area. So Jerusalem and some of the surrounding regions is where Jesus' ministry was solely directed at. And then, of course, we have the notion that he was crucified at the end. So he died by being executed. Unfortunately, not uncommon back in the day. Lots of people were crucified, as you all well know, back in this particular day. All right, Jesus' teachings, what do we know about it? Well, the main theme of Jesus was the kingdom of God. And this is at the heart of his teaching. He talked about it a lot. And when he talked about the kingdom of God, he talked about it as if it was near to those who were willing to participate in it. But he also talked about it in a future tense as well, that in the near future, it would come about in its full form. And so you have this near understanding of it. It's coming soon. And certainly when it came into its full fruition, Jesus spoke of it in terms of him being the ruler of this kingdom that was to come. Now, what this brings about is this very, very early understanding that Jesus is coming back tomorrow after lunch. Yeah. In other words, the imminent return of Jesus. Any day now. You see this dripping in Paul's letters, Any day now, Jesus is going to come. But then Paul is crucified, or not Paul is crucified, but Paul is martyred, all right? Peter is martyred. We have the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 AD, and still no Jesus. This is going to create, and we'll talk about this later, but this is going to create a major, major crisis for the early followers of Jesus, because they honestly believed Jesus was coming back after lunch tomorrow. And when he didn't come back, it creates a bit of a crisis of faith for them. What did we miss? Because an integral part of this was that Jesus, when he returned, he's going to set up his throne in the temple. Well, in 70 AD, the temple gets destroyed. Now what do you do with that? All right. So you see, all of this is going to have to change and adapt and morph over time because of these expectations that do not come about. All right, parables. As you all well know, Jesus taught in parables. I love these parables. They are open-ended. They are open to a myriad of interpretations. But what we need to understand, though, is that all of these parables, in some way, shape, or form, are giving us some insights about the kingdom, because that's at the heart of Jesus' message. He's trying to explain to us what the kingdom is all about, and in particular, what kingdom people are to be. All right? And so whenever we interpret parables, we need to understand it, pretty much in that context. Miracles were a big part of Jesus's ministry, right? He was healing people, blind people can see, lame people can walk. But did you know Jesus was not the only one doing this? These individuals were called miracle workers, all right? And there were a lot of them. Jesus is not the only one walking around healing people, which is a little bit difficult for us to get our heads wrapped around because we imagine Jesus being the only one doing this, but others did it. Now, there are a couple of things, though, that I think are special to the way Jesus did this. One is that whenever Jesus performed a miracle, he typically used it as an object lesson for talking about the kingdom. When the kingdom comes in its fullness, the blind will be able to see, and the lame will be able to walk. And he uses this in order to teach us things about the kingdom that go beyond the literal, right? Classic instances in this, and we talked about this last week, Heather. The blind man in John chapter 9, who Jesus heals so that he can see. And when you read the story, you need to read it with a lot of humor. I mean, because the writer is obviously trying to make this funny. Because here you've got this blind man in John chapter 9 who can see better than all the people who can literally see, who are Pharisees and scribes who should know better, all right? So there's kind of this inside joke going on in John chapter 9 that it's the blind man who can see and the people who have vision are blind. Now, you have to understand this beyond the literal, but that's a big part of what these miracles are trying to teach us. Yes, they were literal in the sense that the blind man actually is, healed, but we need to always understand that there is a theological lesson about the kingdom behind these miracles as well. So there's a point to it. Did you have something to say?
I hear you saying, not only did they have vision, but they could understand.
Theological, yes. There's this theological understanding or theological seeing that would go along with it. Now, the other element that is unique to Jesus is the resurrection, all right, that's going to be the big deal that Paul's going to make in his letter. That, yeah, you might have these other miracle workers, performing miracles, but Jesus is the only one who came back from the dead. And so that big miracle is a thing that will set Jesus apart from some of these other miracle workers. All right, now you also have a very different ethics that Jesus will engage in his teachings. And it's a revolutionary kind of ethics. And so the ethics of the day, for example, was, thou shalt not commit adultery. All right? Well, let me ask you a question. There's a scene when some men catch a woman engaging in adultery. And they bring the woman to Jesus, throw her down in front of him, and say, this woman was caught in adultery. The law demands that she be stoned to death. What do you say? Now, interesting thing about that story, the woman was caught in the act of adultery. How many people does it take to commit adultery?
2.
And how many people did they bring before Jesus?
1.
Where was the man?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Hi, Carol. Come on in.
Hello. This is
So-
an adventure. Coming from upstairs to downstairs. Oh,
Glad you're here, Carol. Very, very glad you're here. We're talking about adultery, by the way.
oh good.
All right, so you caught us
I
right in the
need
middle
to
of
know
this.
all about it.
Oh, you do? Oh, good. You can share with us. All that's to say, the ethics of the day was very much based on, thou shalt and thou shalt nots. Okay? And there were loopholes. Obviously, a lot of loopholes for the wealthy, the powerful, and the men. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
All right?
Definitely.
Jesus is going to cut through all of that by saying it's not strictly about the thou shalts and the thou shalt nots. It's about who you are as a person. So it's not just about thou shalt not commit adultery. It's about what marriage really is. It's about being faithful. It's about being loving. You know, when Jesus is teaching on this, he points everybody back to Genesis chapter 2. The two shall become one flesh. What you need to be is a one flesh woman and a one flesh man. Okay? Which means that if you even look at a woman and lust after her, you gouge your eye out. Now, obviously, Jesus is using hyperbole here, but what he is trying to say is that you need to become the kind of man that is so in love with his wife, you're not even looking at other women. It's all about inner transformation. And when we get to the Sermon on the Mount, we're going to talk a lot more about this. But it's a revolutionary way of looking at ethics that gets us away from the shouts and the shout nots to who are you as a person. It's about inner transformation. And again, it's revolutionary, and it's really cool. And when we get to the Sermon on the Mount, we'll talk more about that. The other thing about Jesus' teachings is that he always taught with authority, and it was a kind of authority that people would recognize. Oh my goodness, this guy knows what he's talking about. Yeah, he teaches with this authority that nobody else has. All right, well, so when we're talking about earthly Jesus and theological Jesus, obviously we're talking about pre and post Easter, all right? In pre-theological Jesus, we emphasize the humanity. But the post-theological Jesus, we're talking more and more about his divinity. Because now, this element about Jesus is entering into the conversation. Before Easter, you don't have any of the followers of Jesus walking around saying to themselves, I wonder if this guy is God. Nobody's talking about that, all right? They're even having questions about whether or not he's the Messiah, much less God, right? But after Easter, you begin to have this conversation about Jesus being more than human. Now, to the end, there's a fight over this. All right, in a big fight. And so we wind up with what's called lower Christology and higher Christology. Lower Christology was willing to admit that Jesus was more than human, that he had divine-like qualities, but they were unwilling to go and take that step and say he was deity, because that would go against monotheism. These become known as the Hebrew Christians, okay? And they had a low Christology because they were trying to protect monotheism, and to do that, they were unwilling to proclaim that Jesus is God, right? On the other end of the spectrum, though, you have the Greek-speaking Christians, or the Hellenist Christians, who were much more comfortable with ascribing to Jesus more and more divine-like qualities. So that you have, for example, in Philippians chapter 2, Paul saying something to the effect that he was the image of God. He was the very image or reflection of God. Paul is probably quoting a hymn there in Philippians chapter 2. And that is reflecting on this. But now, what does it mean that he was the image of God? It's not very detailed, is it? And so that's what the later Nicene fathers are going to start arguing about. Well, what does it mean? And that's when we get the Trinitarian language, which is one God, three persons. Within Jesus, there are two natures, divine, human, joined in a hypostatic union, right? Is any of this stuff making sense to you all? No, because it's nowhere in the New Testament, but it's very theological language that winds up being the Chalcedonian doctrine of the Trinity, and we can get to that later if you all want. But right now, what we have is that he is the image of God, and it's a very beautiful and mysterious way of understanding the divine nature of Christ that they were much more comfortable with in the New Testament era. So anyway, all this is called Christology. Okay, study of Christ is what Christology means, and so the question, who is Jesus, is a big question that the New Testament authors are going to debate about. And when we get into these texts, I'm going to show you the conversation that they're having. They disagree with one another on the answer to that question. And when we get to these texts, I'm going to show you this back and forth that we'll find in these texts, okay? Now, the other thing that we need to understand about the New Testament is that all of the New Testament was written by people, for the most part, who were not direct followers of Jesus. Okay? Did Paul know the earthly Jesus?
No.
No. Okay? All the Gospels are anonymous, so we don't really know who wrote those. James, brother of Jesus, he knew the earthly Jesus. Peter, 1st and 2nd Peter, knew the earthly Jesus. But none of the other writers in the New Testament did. Jude, who was also the brother of Jesus, right? So the vast majority of the New Testament was written by people who actually never met Jesus. So that's something that we have to kind of keep in mind also as we're getting into the text. And one of the reasons why I think you have so many different views of him as well. So we have conflicting stories that we're going to get into about Jesus after Easter, after the resurrection. And when we get into these texts, we're going to talk more about these. We have a few appearances of Jesus after he resurrected, right? You have that picture there of the Emmaus. Jesus appearing to the guys who are walking to Emmaus. You have Jesus appearing to the women first, which I think is theologically very, very important. The first people to see the resurrected Jesus were not the 12. It was the women. And I promise you that was not coincidence. There's important theology when we get to those stories about all of that. But he appeared to the women, then he appeared to the apostles, then he appeared to a few other people, and then of course we get the stories of his ascension in Luke's Acts that we'll talk about when we get there. But it sort of begs the question then, who is the real Jesus, right? Yeah. And this is the picture that I'm thinking that Jim was talking about. Notice the different skin tones, the different haircuts. Top center, you even have kind of an Oriental Jesus there. Second row to the right, you have more of an African Jesus. All right. Was Jesus a Presbyterian?
Probably not.
Probably not. Was he white?
Who knows? Probably not.
Well, he was Semitic, so the answer to that question is no.
Just no.
He was Semitic. Was he an American? No. Yeah. You see where I'm going with this, with all of this? Cultures tend to make Jesus their own. And so you have, for example, in some Sunday school classes, a picture of Jesus with blonde hair, blue eye, and white skin. Well, we know none of that was true. On some level, though, I think imagining Jesus looking like us is not necessarily a bad thing, because it helps us to be able to identify with them, which is why you have an African Jesus and an Oriental Jesus. I think on some level, there's nothing wrong with that, as long as we realize that that's what we're doing. Because on another level, I think it's also very, very important for us to try to understand the real Jesus. And the real Jesus was rural. And the real Jesus was Semitic, which means he had dark olive skin and black hair and curly beard. all right, and a big nose, because that's how Semitics looked back then. Didn't look anything like us, all right? And that, ultimately Jesus was Jewish, and he was teaching in a Jewish context, in a Jewish culture, and at a time when they were being oppressed by the Romans. And so there's this dual thing that we need to do here. I think it's okay for us to embrace a Jesus who looks like us, because that's an approachable Jesus. And I think Jesus wants us to envision him as being very, very approachable. But you don't crucify nice people. You crucify dangerous people, right? And Jesus was dangerous. And as we get into the New Testament, I want to try to help you all to understand and see that part of Jesus, because that's the real Jesus. He was a revolutionary, and he was considered dangerous. He was considered dangerous by his own people, and he was considered dangerous by the Romans, which is why ultimately they executed him. We tend to try to soften Jesus in our day and age because we want to make him more like us. And on some level, that's okay. But on another level, I want you to see just how wild he really was. One of my favorite scenes, and I'll end with this, one of my favorite scenes in the Chronicles of Narnia was when, y'all know the Chronicles of Narnia, right? Y'all know what I'm talking about? Okay.
The Lion, the Witch, and the
The
Wardrobe.
Lion, the Witch, and the
C.S.
Wardrobe.
Lewis.
C.S. Lewis, all right. Well, there's a scene when Lucy, who is the youngest girl, discovers that Aslan, who is the Jesus figure in the story, is a lion. Yeah. And she gets afraid. And she goes, oh, a lion. Ooh, is he tame? And the beaver, follow me on this, these are talking animals in the story, right? The beaver looks at Lucy and says, tame? No! He's not tame. He's wild. But he's good. That's Jesus. C.S. Lewis got that right. He's wild, but he's good. And as we get into the New Testament, I want to try to help you all to see that part of Jesus, right? We have 3 minutes for questions.
Just one real quick comment.
Yeah.
This picture, or one very similar, is on the